This is John Martin and May You Never. In the studio with me at the moment is Chris Manson, who's published the book Lionheart, The Diaries of Richard I, which he acquired from the Germans who, some backstory, took them from Richard I's wife's grave in France during the Second World War, and will give them to the British Museum come 2050. But right now, I've just published the book Lionheart about his diaries. We've got the backstory from you from all angles. Chris, tell us what's in the book. What do the diaries say? What are the stories he's telling us? And what age does he start?
Well, he starts as a 14-year-old. So Richard was actually born in Oxford, funnily enough, at Beauchamp Palace, which is now the site of Worcester College.
Okay.
And then he grew up in Woodstock. There was a palace in Woodstock at that time.
There still is.
In the 12th century. Well, yes, but a slightly different one.
Yeah.
So he starts at 14, but the diaries, because there were 27 volumes that were discovered in his grave, but only 6 of them survive. So it's necessarily a series of windows into his life. The first of them starts when he's 14 and he's being crowned as the Duke of Aquitaine in the cathedral. And it starts with the language of an adolescent,
Yes.
who's obsessed with his brothers, with jealousy, with sex, with violence, with his relationship with both of his parents, which was unusual and certainly very different from the relationship that modern day children have.
In what regard?
Well, he hadn't seen his father for 10 years. His father, as a medieval king, you spent your life on horseback, travelling your kingdom, enforcing your will.
Yes.
And children were brought up in one location. They had wet nurses, so their mothers didn't nurse them themselves. They had tutors. And he spent a good deal of time with his mother, who was, as you know, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a remarkable woman.
Yeah.
Not only because of the history of marrying the 2 great kings at that time, but actually subsequently taking up arms against her second husband. This wasn't a narrow domestic argument. This was her raising an army and fighting against her husband in a time when women's rights were, non-existent. So a remarkable woman, and indeed that's where Richard, as you can see in the book, gets much of his influence from.
And that comes through. Is it a respect for his mother, a love for his mother?
It's a grudging respect, I would say. He sees his mother as a very strong character for rebelling against against his father,
Yes.
her husband. But then he recognises that she is actually a political animal above everything, and is prepared to use all of her feminine wiles to get what she wants. And what she wants is her heartland of Aquitaine to be the flower of chivalry. She created this court of poets and troubadours who sang of great chivalric and heroic feats, and that's the context in which Richard grew up. And that therefore is why he is now seen as this great Christian knight, possibly the greatest Christian hero in history. A very dramatic, romantic figure, much bigger than any of his contemporaries, very handsome, a great tournament warrior, and most of all, in later life, a great military strategist.
Absolutely.
To take an army and march 3,000 miles across Western Europe to attack the Saracens in order to recapture Jerusalem, is an extraordinary military ambition, let alone achievement.
And then but when he came back, of course, he got kidnapped. Had he sort of just taken his eye off the ball? Had he relaxed?
Well, he had.
And is this episode recounted in the diary?
It is, yes. Fortunately, one of the diaries that survives is the period covering the Crusades. So one gets a sense of the huge politics around at that time. You can well imagine that these competing groups or tribes, if you like, as they were at that time, of French and Norman and Aquitanian and English knights, all travelling together to Jerusalem to liberate it. You can imagine the seismic arguments that broke out at that time. Philip II of France was the successor king to Louis, and he was a great rival, a great schemer against Richard, and he left the crusade early, partly because Richard partly through his arrogance, had humiliated Philip. Richard was a great military figure. Philip wasn't, and Richard wasn't sensible enough to allow Philip some of the credit. And indeed, when they captured Acre, and Philip and Richard both marched into the town, Duke Leopold of Austria, who was the third part of the triumvirate, wasn't allowed to have his banners raised above the city, and therefore
so
to participate
as well.
in the ransom. Yes, and as a consequence, when Richard was travelling back through Europe, he ended up being shipwrecked in the lands of Duke Leopold. So rather than getting a friendly reception, he was held hostage and ransomed for what was the equivalent of a quarter of the wealth of England.
That's a king's ransom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where the expression comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. And who is willing to pay for that? I mean, if Richard was away, who makes the decision? You know, that the country will pay. You know,
well, he had
a huge amount of his wealth.
They had a relatively sophisticated form of civil government, which was basically nobles who were appointed to reign in his stead. But in fact, it was his mother who, again, demonstrating her strength and force of character, who effectively forced the nobles to collect the money.
To cough up.
Yeah. So he was imprisoned for a year and was then released, and then spent the rest of his life campaigning against Philip and against Austria in order to recover the lands that had been taken while he was being kidnapped.
And what sort of character, Chris, emerges from this? I mean, we know he's a very brave man and a great military strategist, but was he an academic man? Was he? It sounds like he was a fairly wild egotist. Did he engender great trust and loyalty from his followers, or was there always divisions in the camp? I mean, was he a Machiavellian character?
He learned to become one, and that's one of the things that we see in the diary. So the diaries open with him with the voice of a 14-year-old,
yeah.
And as the diaries progress, you see him maturing. So as an 18-year-old, as a 20-year-old, he's a brave, almost foolhardy knight engaged in some ridiculous adventures, in the way that we do in later life, although perhaps in less glamorous circumstances.
Yeah.
But as he struggles with his father's inheritance, because there were 3 sons, and the tradition was that different lands would be passed to different sons, and he took up arms at various times, both against his father and indeed against his brother. And then one sees a sort of more serious side to him in his relationship with God. You know, they were God-fearing men, albeit that that didn't dominate their lives. You know, the sex, the violence, the jealousy, the ambition is what comes through. But equally, this overriding sense of attachment to God and trying to achieve an everlasting life. And that was why they, marched to Jerusalem in order to try and recapture it, because that is how they thought that they would gain everlasting life.
Absolutely. And then we know where the first 3 diaries are dealing with his younger years. The other 3 which survive, how far into his life do they cover?
Well, they go up until the Crusade period, so until he's captured. So the last of the diaries is actually written when he is first captured and kidnapped. And then at the end, at the back of the last diary, there is a letter that he wrote to Berengaria when he knew he was dying.
When he'd been struck by an arrow?
Yes, he was campaigning. I mean, it was a relatively minor skirmish, ironically. He was engaged in capturing a castle in Aquitaine from a truculent lord. And it was after dinner. I think a few glasses of wine had been taken, and they went out to have a last survey of the castle. And they saw this mad man dancing on the ramparts, and sort of stood there without the normal shields that they would have stood. And this man fired a shot, and it was a lucky shot, and it hit Richard in the gap between his armour on his shoulder.
Gosh.
And he died of gangrene 4 days later. So he knew that he was going to die. At that time, if you had gangrene in your arm or your leg, you were capable of removing it. But obviously in your torso, you're not capable of doing that.
Yeah.
So he knew he was going to die, and the letter is, a moving testament, if you like, to his it was quite unmedieval, his love for his wife. Most marriages at that time were marriages of convenience or political
This was
alliance.
marriage of love.
Yeah.
Well, Chris Manson, thank you very much for coming in. It's a great yarn you've brought us. Lionheart, the Diaries of Richard I are published right now, are available online on Amazon.
The website is lionheartdiaries.com.
Oh, there you go. That's where to get it. Chris, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Here is Aretha Franklin.